This is lecture 4, How Cells Obtain Energy. So this corresponds to the online textbook Concepts of Biology, chapters 4 and 5. There's going to be a lot of detail in those chapters, and I think it is definitely great to read the textbook because it's a good resource to help teach you something again, in another way. But just beware that it's going to be very detail heavy, and for our purpose in this class and the exam, it won't be that detail heavy. Just as long as you get what is the big picture? How do cells get energy? Why is the mitochondria known as the powerhouse of the cell? What about the chloroplasts? How do they make energy? So you don't have to know all the little steps. Definitely not. You're not bio majors, and even if you are, you'll get that much, you'll get more detail in major classes, but not here. This is just kind of an overview, what's the big picture, what's the point, and how does it relate to us and to life, and yeah. So how do cells get energy? So hopefully by the end of this section, you will be able to explain what metabolic pathways are, explain how this molecule called ATP is used by the cell as an energy source, describe the overall outcome of glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation. So just the big picture, not all the little outcomes of each of those, just what's the big picture, what do you get from these processes. Describe the type of fermentation that occurs in animal cells and the conditions that initiate fermentation. Yeah. So introduction. Every task that is done by living organism needs energy. So even though we know some things take energy, like heavy labor and exercise, that takes up a lot of energy, right? But even things that we don't usually think of as requiring a lot of energy, it does take energy because your cells are doing things. So even thinking and sleep, your brain cells and your nervous system are communicating, and they're sending messages to each other, and they're doing things. So even though we think of that as a passive thing, that does require energy too. And thinking does require a lot of energy. It's really interesting. So I mentioned that my bachelor's was in neuroscience. And so one thing that I learned that was really surprising to me was that your brain uses a lot of glucose compared to the rest of your body. So glucose is the energy molecule that our cells use. And so your brain uses 30% of the total glucose that your body uses, which is really surprising, but it makes sense because thinking requires a lot of different nerve cells talking and sending messages to each other. And so even when you're studying and you're realizing I've been studying a lot, and for some reason I've been getting hungry kind of sooner, there is kind of a relationship between that, because you are expending energy when you're thinking and studying and working hard. Your brain cells and your nervous system, they are at work doing things. So thinking does require energy, and even sleep, different stages of sleep kind of help different things. And yeah, so things that we don't even think of as requiring a lot of energy takes energy from your cells. So we get food that we eat. So kind of tied back to lecture 3, the food that we eat and the molecules that we consume get used for things that we need in our cells, and especially for energy. So the nutrients that we eat and other molecules get imported into cells, broken down, and then possibly made into new molecules. And that's basically your metabolism. It's that process of breaking some things down and also making new things. And if we think about the big picture again, ultimately most life forms get their energy from the sun because of the food chain and food webs. So the first kind of link in the chain is producers. So producers, like plants, use photosynthesis to capture sunlight. So producers, make energy. They are what we would call autotrophs. So they make their own energy. And then I'll get back to that term later in the lecture. So producers make energy by converting the sunlight into chemical energy. And then consumers, like animals, get their energy from producers. So there's different kinds of consumers. Again, the term that we could apply is also heterotrophs. So hetero meaning like different, they get their energy source from somewhere else. So consumers have to consume something for their energy. So for example, like animals. And there's different kinds of consumers, like herbivores just eat plants. Carnivores eat other animals. So carnivores will usually eat the herbivores. So that's where the bigger picture, again, like the links and the chains of the plants make the energy. And then an herbivore eats the plants, and then a carnivore eats the herbivore. So you could see how ultimately the energy came from the sunlight, that the original source, the plant, converted into chemical energy. And then it got eaten, and then that energy goes to whatever eats it, so the carnivore. And then ultimately when things, die and kind of join the circle of life, there are other organisms called decomposers. So that includes like fungi, bacteria, and worms. They get their nutrients from the decomposition of plant and animal material. So yeah, when things like die, these organisms kind of feed off of that and then return the nutrients into the cycle. So it really is like a whole circle of life, of energy, that ultimately came from the sun, and got converted into chemical energy that then got put into the cycle. So again, kind of like, I guess, medium picture, if we think about us as humans, and the stuff that we eat and the macromolecules that we eat. So the large proteins that make up our muscles are built from smaller molecules, from amino acids. So remember, they're polymers, so the building blocks that make the macromolecules are called amino acids, and they build proteins. So when you eat protein, you're digesting it and breaking it back down into amino acids, and then your body can use those amino acids to build new proteins and things. So that's why you might see, especially if you're like, going to the gym a lot, you might see supplements of like protein powder or even amino acid powder, because amino acids build protein. So that's one kind of macromolecule. But the main one that we get energy from are carbohydrates. So complex carbohydrates are ones that are longer chains of those rings. And so those big longer chains, when we eat them, get broken down into the smaller rings that we call simple sugars. And that's what the cell uses for energy. It breaks down those simple sugars in this process that we're going to talk about today. So that's also kind of why they say that complex carbs are better than like simple carbs in your diet, because complex carbs are bigger, like the molecules are bigger, and so you can kind of break it down over longer periods of time, versus simple sugars. If you eat something that's sugary, it's already broken down into its most simple form, and you have like an excess of energy that then has to get stored in the form of like fats and things like that. So that's why they recommend complex carbs over like simple carbs. But either way, carbs are important in your diet because they do provide energy. So again, that's what we're going to talk about partly today. So energy is required by your cells to make and break molecules, and then to move molecules in and out of cells. So all that stuff that we think of like cells doing, it takes energy. It takes energy to do that. So they have to get that from somewhere, and that's from carbohydrates. So living things consume sugars. Again, that's another word that we apply to carbohydrates. Sugars are like the smaller form of the carbs. So living things consume sugars as a major energy source, because these molecules have a lot of energy stored in their bonds. So in those rings, there's a lot of chemical bonds, and we don't need to get into it because it's not a chemistry class, but having bonds, there's energy in those bonds, and so we break those to release energy and then use it in our cells. But we can't just have like free energy. That's why we have to kind of make and break bonds to get and transfer energy. because a living cell can't store just big amounts of free energy. Too much would result in an increase of heat in the cell, which would then break down all the enzymes and proteins in your cell and destroy the cell. So you can't just have like free energy. It has to kind of be stored in these bonds that get made and broken by different molecules. So the main energy molecule that our cells use is this molecule called adenosine triphosphate, just shortened as ATP. So in some figures you might see, you know, little 3 letters ATP, and it's usually in like a little burst. So ATP is the molecule that our cells use to store energy safely and then release it for use as needed. So this molecule, you don't really have to know too much about the details, again, but it's just to show you, like, so this is the molecule. It's called adenosine triphosphate. So all of the stuff that make up the cell make up that name, basically. But where the bonds are right here is kind of where most of the energy is stored. So there are these phosphate groups, 1 phosphate group, 2 phosphate group, and then the 3rd phosphate group. They don't really like being next to each other. There's like a lot of tension and energy, like by them, those 3 groups being so close together. And so there's a lot of energy released when the 3rd phosphate group leaves. Like it gets broken off and then it leaves. So it's kind of like a spring that's being compressed and like very tense, and once you let it go, you know, it like goes boing and releases energy. And so that's kind of like what this molecule does. The energy is kind of like in the tension between that 3rd phosphate group, and it really wants to leave. It wants to get out. It's like when you're living at home and you're like, I really need to get out of here. I cannot wait to get out of here. That's like that 3rd phosphate group. It's like just waiting to like be broken off and then go do its own thing. So this molecule is like an energy, like a portable charger for your phone. You know, the little like whatever shape they can be in, but it's like a portable charger for your phone. You can't just carry around electricity in your pocket. Like you would just die. You'd get electrocuted. And that's kind of like what it is like for the cell. You can't just have free energy. It would just like overheat the cell and then die. And so this portable charger, you can kind of recharge and then take it on the go and then use it as needed. So that's kind of what this molecule is like. It's ATP. There's this energy stored in the molecule. And so it's like holding energy, and then later when the cell needs energy, it can use it up by breaking off that last group in the molecule. And then it's like dead. The charger's like dead. And then you have to recharge it, and then you can use it again. So that's what ATP is like. It's kind of like a portable charger for your phone. Yeah. So you'll see this come up in today's lecture, and that's why, because this molecule is basically storing energy. And so if you make more of these molecules, you're making more energy. So the process that our cells use to get energy from carbohydrates is called cellular respiration. So it's kind of neat because the word ties in the big picture. So we breathe in oxygen and then breathe out carbon dioxide. And so we breathe in oxygen, we do respiration because our cells need that oxygen. So cellular respiration is the name for the process where our cells actually use that oxygen to help make energy. Yeah. So how do your cells get energy from carbohydrates? The process is very complex, but again, just think of the big picture. So we break down complex carbs into the simple carbs, and the simplest carb is glucose. It's just that one like sugar ring. So glucose is, this is the molecular formula for glucose. And you don't really need to know that much detail. Again, this isn't chemistry, but just to show. And so you break down a glucose molecule, and with the oxygen that we breathe in, this whole process and chemical reactions end up like mixing and matching the atoms into water and carbon dioxide and molecules of that ATP. But if we were to like show, you know, like a balanced equation, this is balanced so that like all of the atoms on this side of the equation are just rearranged on that side. So chemical reactions are kind of like what they say, like changing dance partners. So all the atoms are still there, but they're just getting rearranged into the end products of water and carbon dioxide. Yeah. And so you don't really need to memorize that, but just again, the big picture of like, okay, we're breaking down glucose and using the oxygen that we breathe in is how we make energy. We make some water molecules, and then we make carbon dioxide. And so that's why we have to breathe out carbon dioxide, because all of our cells are breathing in and then breathing out and doing all this process of cellular respiration. So you need to breathe in oxygen for your cells to use to break down glucose. And then it makes carbon dioxide as like a waste product, and so that's why we have to breathe out carbon dioxide. You can't hold your breath forever, not just because you need more oxygen, but also you're building up carbon dioxide, and that buildup, you know, can be toxic. So that's why you have to breathe out carbon dioxide. Yeah. So the cellular respiration is the name for the whole thing, but there's 3 pathways. And again, you're gonna, if you look up videos, you'll see a lot of detail about each of those processes. You don't really have to know that level of detail, so don't get scared. Just know that like that whole process is actually a lot of processes working together. So here's kind of a summary. Again, you don't need to know this level of detail and all the molecules that go in and out and convert into what. If you ever take biochemistry, you definitely will get that level of detail and have to know that. But not here. This is an introductory class, and again, like we're trying to shift towards how is this relevant to your daily life? How is it relevant to us as a society and all that? Cellular respiration in total is made of these 3 pathways. And you don't need to know the details of each pathway, but you could just see that we're making some of that molecule ATP in each of those. So here, it's not shown in yellow, but you're making some. And then in this process, you're making some. But the process that you make the most in is this last one called oxidative phosphorylation. And that's technically where the oxygen gets put to work. And it makes the majority of the ATP molecules and energy of all 3 pathways. Like most of it comes from this last one. So why do we need to breathe in oxygen? Because of that process. Oxygen is required in that last pathway. So again, it's called oxidative phosphorylation because it is using the oxygen and it's doing this process called phosphorylation to make a bunch of these molecules of ATP. So that's why we need to breathe in oxygen, because we need the oxygen on the like molecular and cellular level. Each of our cells needs the oxygen to be able to make the energy that your cell needs. Yeah, so if you're ever like, you know, if you think about it beforehand, why do we need to breathe? Because we need oxygen. But why? This is why. Oxygen is needed for each of your cells to make energy and to like function. So, yeah. Even though this is like a small level, you know, molecular thing, it does relate to the big picture. Like that's why we need to breathe and respire, because our cells need the oxygen. Yeah. And then, so why do we breathe in oxygen and then breathe out carbon dioxide? Like I mentioned with the equation, we breathe out carbon dioxide because it's a waste product. So the second stage of cellular respiration, we generate carbon dioxide molecules as like a waste product, a byproduct. So that's not like the end goal that we're trying to make. It's just like a waste product that ends up getting made as we like shuffle around things. So we generate carbon dioxide, but too much carbon dioxide buildup can cause damage in cells. So that's why we need to get rid of it by breathing it out. Yeah, so I think biology, I think sometimes is taught as just like memorize this, memorize this, memorize this, but it's super important to remember the big picture. Like, why do we need to breathe? Because our cells need that oxygen. Why do we need to breathe out? And like, why do we breathe out carbon dioxide? Because it just gets made as like a waste product through these processes, and we need to breathe it out. Yeah. And so the one thing that we all remember about biology for some reason is that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. And why? That's because that's where all these processes happen. So the last two pathways in cellular respiration happen inside the mitochondria. And those processes, like I said, make the most ATP, the most energy. And so that's why, yeah, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Like, it generates the power for your cells to function, basically. So, again, whatever, I was going to go on a tangent, but so again, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell because it makes the energy. And now we know it's because this whole process of cellular respiration happens there. And so again, if we look back at this equation, you don't have to memorize the equation, but just the big picture. You start out with glucose. And with the oxygen that you breathe in through these three pathways, you end up making energy, not shown on this equation. And then you generate water and carbon dioxide. So that's why we breathe out carbon dioxide, because you made it as a waste product from cellular respiration. And so that's basically it. That's a big picture of cellular respiration. That's where your cells get energy. I definitely think it could be helpful to still watch videos and read the textbook to kind of see the whole process through. But as far as like memorization and learning, do you get the big picture? How cells break down this molecule called glucose, shown here in the whole ring. It gets broken down halfway and then modified, and then that molecule gets broken down. So that's the big picture of cellular respiration. You don't have to know the details of every pathway, but if you were to watch the videos, it could be helpful just to see how glucose gets broken down from this 6-carbon molecule in half, and then those molecules get altered and sent through this whole cycle, and then that cycle ends up basically powering this last stage or phase, and then that is what makes the most ATP. So again, I think reading the textbook kind of helps, and reading the videos, but again, as long as like memorization and like learning what is the big picture, the fact that we break down the sugar, the carbohydrate, glucose, and through this whole series of processes we make energy in the form of that molecule ATP. That's how I would just summarize it. So sometimes there are some organisms that don't need oxygen. So like some bacteria and yeast, they can do this process called fermentation. So they don't always live in an environment where there is oxygen, so they evolve to have a different way to get their energy. So some organisms can do this process called fermentation to make energy without oxygen. So those organisms that are maybe not living in an environment that they always have oxygen can still get energy. So, for example, well, there are two kinds of fermentation. So there's lactic acid fermentation and alcohol fermentation. And so they are similar, that they are making energy in a different way. And they actually both do glycolysis. So they do break down the glucose molecule in that first phase of cellular respiration, right? So they split it in half. And then they each do a different pathway. So instead of the two other pathways that are used in cellular respiration, once you break down the glucose, those molecules get put into like a different alternate pathway to make energy without having to rely on oxygen. So these two forms are called lactic acid fermentation and alcohol fermentation. So lactic acid fermentation is used by animals and some bacteria, like those in yogurt. So a lot of cases in science and biology, we'll happen to notice something and be like, oh, that's kind of cool. How can we use that? So bacteria like those in yogurt, they do this process of fermentation and they make this thing called lactic acid as a product. So that is not their end goal, you know, it's still just to make energy in the form of ATP, but it happens to make this molecule called lactic acid as a product. And so that is what we use some good bacteria for in yogurt, to make lactic acid and have that. So if you see in your yogurt that it says like live and active cultures, that is that bacteria that's doing this lactic acid fermentation. And so these are good bacteria that aren't going to make you sick. We just rely on them to make the stuff that we like to eat. And so this also happens in animal cells that are not getting enough oxygen to produce energy fast enough. So for example, if you're working out like really hard, you're working out strenuously and you know you're breathing pretty hard, but you're not getting the cells oxygen fast enough for them to do cellular respiration and produce energy. They have to produce energy some other way, so then they'll switch to fermentation. So they can do this lactic acid fermentation, and your muscle cells will do that. And when they make that lactic acid as a byproduct, that changes the pH, and that's what makes your muscles sore afterwards or during. That's what makes your muscles sore, because it's producing this lactic acid, and that's like changing the pH, and then that causes, you know, changes. And that's a sign that you're doing lactic acid fermentation. So yeah, your muscle cells can do this kind of fermentation if they're not getting enough oxygen fast enough to do cellular respiration. And then the other form of fermentation is called alcohol fermentation. And so this produces, again, as like a byproduct, it's meant to make energy, but as a byproduct, it produces this molecule called ethanol, which is alcohol that, you know, we drink. So we, again, kind of like use that for ourselves to our advantage. So we'll have fermentation by yeast produce the ethanol that's found in alcoholic drinks. Or a student even mentioned to me that that's probably how, you know, they brew kombucha. You know, they ferment stuff to make kombucha, and they usually remove the alcohol, but there are some alcoholic versions of kombucha that just, they leave the alcohol in. So yeah, organisms that can do alcohol fermentation will end up just producing ethanol, and we kind of just let that, you know, use that to our advantage. So those are the two forms of fermentation that you can, some cells can do alternatively if they don't have oxygen. And again, if we think about the big picture and like the food chain and food webs, it all starts with photosynthesis. So all living organisms on Earth, you know, have one or more cells. Some things are just one cell, and that's one organism. Other things like us are made of like, you know, trillions of cells. I don't know if trillions is accurate, but you get what I'm saying. So each cell runs on the chemical energy found in carbohydrate molecules. So the food that we eat, we get carbohydrates that we break down into that smallest one, glucose, and then we do cellular respiration. But where did that come from? Where did those carbohydrates come from? So these molecules are made by photosynthesis. So through photosynthesis, certain organisms convert solar energy, sunlight, into chemical energy. And so, yeah, we wouldn't be able to live with just sunlight. We rely on eating the carbohydrates from other organisms, and so through photosynthesis and their ability to convert solar energy to chemical energy, this chemical energy in plants is what's used to build those carbohydrate molecules, and then cells can use those to perform work. So again, this term, so autotrophs are organisms that are able to produce their own food. And there are you can make your own food through like chemistry, but photoautotrophs specifically are ones that use sunlight and carbon to make chemical energy in the form of carbohydrates. So autotrophs is kind of like anything that can make its own energy, and then photoautotrophs are the ones that do that by using sunlight to make their energy. So autotrophs make their own. Heterotrophs are organisms that have to obtain energy from the food by consuming other organisms. So that would be like us humans. Yeah. So ultimately, heterotrophs end up getting their food because you could trace back down the food web or food chain that it relied on autotrophs being eaten at some point to make the energy that we can break down for cellular respiration. So again, photosynthesis has, a lot of different steps and 2 big phases, but as long as you get the big picture, that photosynthesis uses sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water, and that is what ends up getting kind of like broken down and rearranged and makes energy in the form of sugars. So this is what gets used, and then this is what gets made, the sugar molecules. And so this picture is kind of just showing that, like the big picture of a tree. It takes in carbon dioxide, sunlight, and then water from the ground, and that is what helps make photosynthesis happen and rearrange all these atoms to make the sugar molecules that the cells of the plant need, and then that we end up eating. And a byproduct in photosynthesis is actually oxygen. So it's not like the point is to make oxygen, but it happens to make oxygen, and then so it releases it into the air and the atmosphere. So below is the equation summarizing photosynthesis. If you notice, it's kind of the exact opposite of cellular respiration. So in this case, plants take in carbon dioxide, and the water that we, if you have houseplants, if you water your plants, you need to give them water because that's what drives photosynthesis. So if you don't water your plants, you'll notice they die. You might think like, well, why are you dying? You have sunlight. But it's that balance of sunlight and water that drives the photosynthesis to have the plants have the energy that they need. So they take in the carbon dioxide and the water, and with the sunlight, that helps them power making sugar molecules in the form of glucose. So again, this is that same molecule of glucose, and then it happens to make oxygen as a byproduct. So yeah, if you notice, it's exactly the opposite of cellular respiration. And so that's why we kind of depend on each other. Plants and animals depend on each other because we both happen to benefit from each other in the processes that we do. So photosynthesis mainly happens in plant leaves. So it's only going to really happen in places that will reach sunlight. So it won't happen in like roots and things like that. So in plant leaves, basically anything that's green is where there's going to be photosynthesis happening. So it mainly happens in plant leaves, not so much, like the root or the stalk or the trunk or whatever. It's in leaves. And so specifically, it's not like on the surface of the leaves. If you were to like cut a leaf like in half and look at that half under a microscope, there's this layer in the middle called the mesophyll, and that's where photosynthesis happens. Those cells are what make photosynthesis happen. So in those cells in the middle layer, you have plant cells, that we learned about the structure. And in specifically plant cells, there are chloroplasts. So chloroplasts are the organelle in plant cells that are specifically responsible for making energy from photosynthesis. So if we zoom in and zoom in and zoom in on a chloroplast, there's all these little structures, and you don't necessarily need to know, again, the details, but just chloroplasts for sure are where this happens. And chloroplasts are green because of these molecules in here, these little structures in here. And so that's why plants are green, because of these molecules and these structures inside the chloroplasts, and that gives the color. So yeah, like I said, anything that is going to be doing photosynthesis is usually going to be green because it has these chloroplasts to receive the sunlight and then convert the energy. So this is where that happens. And then if you also notice on leaves, there are little like holes, like little pores. And that's where the leaves let out oxygen and take in more carbon dioxide. So it's, yeah, their version of breathing basically is they do that through these little holes in the leaves. So they let the carbon dioxide in and then oxygen out. So like I said, in plant cells in this area of the leaf, the chloroplasts is where the photosynthesis happens. So there are two stages of photosynthesis, stages or phases. So kind of like cellular respiration, it's like, big parts. And so the two stages are the light-dependent reactions and the Calvin cycle. And so if we were to break down the word photosynthesis, it's kind of showing the way those two processes work. So light-dependent reactions is the photo part. That's what depends on the light. And then the Calvin cycle is the synthesis part. That's what drives making the actual glucose molecule. So the light-dependent reactions are what absorb energy from the sunlight and then convert it into chemical energy. And then the Calvin cycle uses that chemical energy in the molecules to build sugar molecules. So again, why do I need to water my plants? Because water is required for that first part to convert the sun's energy into chemical energy. Water gets broken down and then split. And that's how it makes the oxygen molecules that end up having to get released. So that's why you have to water your plants. I honestly forget, and it's so funny when it makes a difference. Like you water it and then the next day it's back to life. Like, wow, I guess it just really needed water. But this is why, because water is necessary to help break down, to help convert that sun energy into the chemical energy and then make the sugar molecules that the plant needs to survive. And so this image is just showing that relationship between us organisms that consume oxygen and the glucose that we get from things that we eat. And we break that down for our energy, and we happen to release carbon dioxide. And then plants get to consume that carbon dioxide and build glucose molecules, and then they release oxygen. So we depend on each other in this cycle. So how cells obtain energy is, depending on the organism. If it's the photoautotroph like plants, then it's doing photosynthesis. And then humans and other heterotrophs ultimately get their sugar molecules, the carbohydrates, from something that ate a plant. And now we can use that carbohydrate, break it down, make our own energy, and that's why we also, we rely on each other in more than one way, not just like the energy in the food, but also the oxygen and carbon dioxide, this whole cycle. So that is lecture 4, how cells obtain energy.